And good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to another live Xanadu Gallery online critique group session. Today is Wednesday, February 16th, 2022. It's great to be back here with you on a Wednesday morning. And this week's session is, as I mentioned last week, and it's an Ask Me Anything session. And I got some great questions. You always deliver with good questions. And so I do want to jump right into those. We've got probably more questions than I can answer, but we're going to work our way through them. And I don't want to move too quickly. I want to give both breadth and depth to the answers. So let's jump in and do that. And our first question comes to us from Ontario, from Anne. Hold on here. Let me get it up. And the question is about pricing. And this is a fairly common topic for us here in the critique group sessions. We quite frequently talk about pricing as we're reviewing each other's work. But Anne wants some specifics, and she says, I'm interested in asking about pricing. In the past, I've broken it into three parts: materials, hours based on an hourly wage of $20, and the next is always different. I call it the angst factor. Could you advise on strategies for pricing? So it's a good question, and I think one that we often face as a challenge is kind of thinking about what value should I give to my artwork as I'm thinking about getting it out into the marketplace. And I see some potential challenges with the approach that you're mentioning, Anne. And let's kind of come at it from this angle. I would want to think about this as my potential buyer. As my buyer is experiencing my artwork, encountering it maybe in a gallery or at an art show or festival or in your studio, we want to come up with a price point that is going to encourage them to make a purchase, right? We want it to be optimized to a point where the buyer feels like it is a value that it aligns with the work that they're seeing, that is a value that will allow you to generate some profit from the sale, and that everyone can kind of go away from the transaction happy. The challenge with the approach that you're mentioning is that it allows a lot of variation in the pricing, which can lead to some confusion. So, for example, materials are probably going to hopefully stay fairly stable, although certainly we've seen those climbing and being a little bit erratic over the past year or so. But if they do rise, they're going to kind of rise in unison, and so you should see a similar price point across your work. Hours based on an hourly wage. Now, this I do see as a bit of a challenge, and let me kind of explain why I perceive it being this way. And that is that as an artist, I suspect you would agree that sometimes your very best work is work that just flows. You get in a zone. Everything comes together, the creative stars align, your muse is there, and you create an amazing piece of artwork that just happens relatively quickly. And then there are other times that you struggle. You come into the studio and you're fighting with your materials and your composition and you're back and forth, and it just does not flow. And ultimately, you might even end up saying, gosh, I almost just have to quit because it's just not working. And you put all this time into it. And I would say that time doesn't necessarily align to the final product. And so with those two scenarios, if you are pricing by your hours that are going into it, in a way, you penalize yourself when things work well, and are rewarding yourself when they maybe don't come together as well as you would hope they would. Now, hopefully over time, there's less and less of that as you become more experienced and more skilled in your craft and artisanship. Hopefully that the artwork that you're producing comes more steadily. But even artists that I know that have been working at this for many, many years will still mention that sometimes there's a bit of a struggle involved. And so I see a difficulty in correlating that to the work. And that goes to your third variable, and that you're putting in, which you called the angst factor. I'm not quite sure how you would define that angst factor. I'm not sure if that's the angst that you feel in the process of creating the art, the angst that you feel about letting go of the art because it's so great, or perhaps the angst that you feel that you're not sure how much people will appreciate or understand the art. Sounds pretty subjective. And so with all of those variables at play, my concern would be that as you have a grouping of artwork that's going out to be seen by the public and potentially purchased, that you could run into a situation where your best art, and it's even hard to use that word because that's subjective, but the work that is maybe your strongest ends up not being at the value that it should be. The other factor is that sometimes you look at art and think it's wonderful, and your clients don't think that so much. And conversely, there are going to be times when they see a piece that they just fall in love with, and you raise an eyebrow and say, "I don't get it. I hated that piece. I thought about burning it." And so having this subjective approach leads to all of those kinds of challenges. And so my encouragement is to work toward coming up with an approach to pricing that allows you to eliminate all those variables. Almost all, if not all, of the artists that I'm working with have done this and come up with some approach to creating a formula that is much more objective. That is that, and most of my two-dimensional artists are art that is intended to hang on the wall. Most of them are pricing by the square inch, where they just have a simple flat per square inch price that they apply to their work. Now it gets a little bit more complex than that because sometimes it'll be a sliding scale based on the size of the work. But in essence, whatever the formula they end up ultimately coming up with, they're applying it across all of their work, regardless of how they may or may not be emotionally attached to that artwork. And I encourage this. We just don't need to introduce, it's already complex enough for a potential art buyer to try and understand the value of artwork, where if we're throwing a bunch of additional variables at them and inconsistency in pricing, we make it that much more complex and introduce potential doubts for them. And we just don't want to do that. Now, in a forum like this, we're not going to have an opportunity to go into all of the ins and outs of coming up with your formula for pricing your artwork. But the basic outline is that I encourage you to kind of look around the marketplace and look for competitors and work on figuring out how they're pricing their artwork. See if you can break it down into that per square inch pricing formula and to price your work similarly. Now, let me throw this out to the group if I can, and let me get us here in a format where I can see more of you. Have any of you gone through this process of going from a more sporadic, subjective approach to pricing to a more formulaic approach? And if you have, what was that experience like? Did you find it beneficial? What are some maybe the challenges that you saw? And if you want to hop in, throw a hand up or click on the hand icon. Let me go to Leslie Newman first. And it should be asking it unmute, and then I'll go to Tim.
So yes, years ago I went through this. I do two-dimensional art, and I do it by the square inch, but I do have a sliding scale because otherwise it turns out that your 5 by 7 inch paintings, are worth $6,000, and your 4 foot by 6 foot paintings are worth, $7,000. So the price per square inch actually gets cheaper as you get bigger. And
yeah, that would be fairly typical.
Get littler. And I find that it gives you great peace of mind if you have a formula. People want to know what your prices are, whether you're working with art consultants or whether you're working, with galleries or whether you're working directly with collectors. Everybody wants to know that this is it. And then if they want to engage you in a dialogue about, well, can you do anything for me here? You have a starting place, and it's very consistent.
Yeah, excellent. And did it simplify your life to move to this approach?
Absolutely.
Yeah, dramatically, right? Because now we don't have to spend all that emotional energy trying to figure out how we price the work. Excellent. Thank you, Leslie. Tim, let me go to you. Tim Wilson, it should be asking you to unmute.
Yeah, well, as you know, Jason, I took your course, your institute, and before that, I really didn't have a clue how to price things. I used to think the ones that I liked more, I'd price higher. And then one of the lessons you had was to, I don't know if it was get like 15 different artists and get the prices of people who are kind of in your range of what you were doing and get a price based on per square inch based on that. And so that's kind of worked. One gallery that I'm part of now thought the prices were right on with what they were looking for. So
Yeah, it's, pricing is, I understand how it can be such a challenge. It is really subjective. Ultimately, if you look at any piece of artwork and you try to deconstruct the value of that artwork, you're not going to be able to do it. It is, ultimately it comes down to what is the buyer willing to pay for that artwork, and what are you willing to let it go for. And so, ultimately, it's not necessarily that there is a right or wrong answer. It's just that we have to come up with an approach and make a decision about the value of the artwork. What's it worth to us? Our buyers have to decide what it's worth to them, and we want to try and align that as closely as we can. So we will certainly be having more discussions in this forum. We talk about this all the time in the Art Business Academy. Pricing is a critical element of approaching. And by the way, this is something that I'm having conversations with the artists that I'm representing quite frequently. We're talking about the value of their work. We're kind of gauging how sales are going, and a sales and demand increase. We want to talk about steadily increasing the value of the artwork. And so it's an ongoing process and an ongoing question that needs to be answered. Here's another question, also from Canada. And Sue, it's also about pricing. And kind of segues right in from what we were talking about. And Sue asks, when you need to raise your prices, should you let your current customers know beforehand? There is certainly an opportunity here where you've got an existing client base and you're considering raising the value of your work. There can be an opportunity to give your existing clients a little bit of a benefit for being collectors of your work. It can also be an encouragement to purchase now and generate some additional revenue for you. And so we just want to handle that a little bit carefully. We don't want to come across as, your local car dealership, or, buy now, hurry in, all those kind of things. But if handled properly, and we have done this where we know an artist is going to be raising prices, we'll reach out to collectors and just in an informative way let them know, such and such an artist in the coming months is going to be seeing an increase in value. If you're considering making a purchase of one of their pieces, now would be a great time to do that, and it can encourage activity. So yes, you just kind of want to think about, again, put yourself in your buyer's shoes and think about, how could I word my outreach and my promotion to my collectors in such a way that it won't feel like pressure or hype and that kind of thing. We also want to think a little bit carefully when we're doing a price increase. We want to avoid creating sticker shock. And so I'd be cautious if you're thinking about a 30 or 40 or 50% increase in value. I might suggest that it'd be a good idea to do that over time, and allow there to be some adjustment to the value of the work over time. And of course, as you're reaching out to different audiences and getting into different markets, it could very much become a necessity to have this kind of price increase. Now, if you're been focused in showing on a local market that's not as well developed, and you're now starting to do outreach to galleries in more developed art markets, it is likely that you're going to have an increase in value. And that kind of opens up a whole nother can of worms that we're not going to dive into right here, but certainly things to consider as we're doing a pricing increase. Daryl asks, and let me get his question up here, and he is from Utah. And he asks, is there certain sizes you'd recommend to offer galleries that are better to ship in reference to cost, arriving safely, etc.? So it's a good question. We have talked about sizing here before, and certainly there are considerations when it comes to sizing. Many of you know that I recommend being able to offer a variety of sizes, that this will help your galleries kind of be able to select work that they feel would fit best with their clientele, that will work best in their venue. And so if you can offer some variety, it's a good idea to do that. However, it is also a good idea to kind of think about some of the logistics that come along with sizing. I've had discussions with artists before who like to work large and have to therefore think about, yes, shipping. Also, we ran into an artist, I can't remember if it was in one of these sessions or in the Art Business Academy, but he ran into an issue where he builds his stretchers in his studio. And he managed to build a stretcher in his studio that was so large, it wouldn't fit out the front door. And so he ended up having some real challenges, having to unstretch and deconstruct the canvas. And so we want to be thinking about this. And when it comes to shipping, yes, there definitely are some considerations with shipping as well. We know, for instance, that if if the size of a framed piece of artwork or an unframed piece of artwork, for that matter, if the total size is over 40 by 50 inches, it's highly likely that we're not going to be able to go UPS or FedEx. We're going to have to go with a freight carrier. And that does introduce some logistical challenges, some cost issues. And so there are going to be some considerations there. Whenever possible, there is a preference that would be able to ship using those common carriers. Now, having said that, I would just say that ultimately we don't want those shipping considerations to become constraints on your work. There are no logistical issues that cannot be solved. I was involved, our gallery was involved in shipping a monumental, 12-foot high and something like 20-foot long sculpture from the interior of China, where it was cast by an American artist, a Chinese-American artist who was traveling back and forth. It was cast there and had to be shipped and delivered in the United States to a park installation. And there are people out there who can solve those kinds of challenges. So I wouldn't let logistical considerations restrain me from sizes. But if I were thinking about creating a painting, as an example, and my choice was, well, I could paint it at 42 by 52, or I could paint it at 40 by 50. And, I kind of know where my limits are for shipping. That's a pretty nominal difference. And if you kind of think about that and you say, well, if I keep it at 40 by 50, then I can ship it more easily. Why wouldn't I make the decision to simplify my life a little bit and use that smaller size? Now, the other consideration that I might mention is that a lot of the artists we represent at Xanadu will tend to work in they'll work in a range of sizes, but within that range, they'll tend to choose standard sizes. That the artist will say, I enjoy doing 30 by 40s and 40 by 50s, and also some panoramic work at 20 by 60. And they'll tend to do a lot of work in those various sizes. And that simplifies their supply chain process and their selection process. And sometimes having that framework that they're working in can make the creative process a little bit easier, in that they're not having to reinvent, their composition and scale of each piece of artwork every time they come into the studio. And so it's definitely something over time that's worth thinking about, and especially as you start ramping up your production out of your studio and you're becoming more prolific, it can definitely be a good idea to work towards simplifying everything that you can. Your frame supplier, if you frame your work, who's providing the other materials so that you can just not be spending your time chasing everything down, but instead have a process that you will. I mean, it almost sounds like, and whenever I start talking like this, I'm always concerned that you could start feeling this way. It almost feels like you're creating an art factory to a certain degree. And I'm not suggesting that. You certainly still have latitude to be creative and do different things. But if you can get some efficiencies and optimize your production process, certainly as you think about, the next 10 or 20 or 30 years of your career, any decisions you can make now that are going to allow you to simplify and that those efficiencies will be multiplied over the years, you can start to see some real benefit from that. Louisa asked several questions, and let me get Louisa up here. And Louisa is a member of the Art Business Academy. Maybe these would fit better over there, but we're going to take them here because they're good things for us to think about. If you are thinking about approaching galleries, these are certainly considerations. And she asks, is there an optimal time of the year to approach a gallery with portfolios by email? 2, is there a time of the year that's not recommended? And 3, are there words of advice you have for a cover email letter to accompany each portfolio? Is one necessary, and how much time should we spend crafting such a letter for each different gallery? So this is right in the wheelhouse of the Art Business Academy. There are several lessons where we're talking about the specifics. So Louisa, you are going to get to those. But let me just kind of take a general approach here to give us all an idea if, maybe we're not quite ready to approach galleries, but as we're thinking about that, it can be helpful to kind of have an understanding of at least the general outline of the approach that I recommend. And that is that when it comes to approaching galleries, the name of the game is numbers. You want to put your portfolio in front. Hold on here. There we go. You want to think about getting your portfolio out to as many galleries as you can. There can be this tendency to want to think about, maybe it's more this. There can be a tendency to put a lot of weight and mental energy into each individual opportunity that you have to approach a gallery. The challenge with thinking about approaching galleries in that way is that you start putting you turn it into a high stakes process, right? Where, I found a gallery in a great market that I would really, really love to show in, and I'm going to send them a digital copy of my portfolio. I'm going to be emailing them with a cover letter, as Louisa's mentioning here. And boy, it would mean so much to me to show in this gallery. The problem with that approach is that, in my experience, the likelihood of any one individual gallery both being interested in your work and being excited by it, and being in a position where they're ready to take on a new artist and that you're going to fit with the other artists that they're showing, there's just a lot that has to align there for that to happen. And so the chances in any one individual gallery tend to be a little bit low. You just can't know how those variables are going to align as you're getting ready to approach the gallery. And so if I'm turning it into a high stakes approach and putting a lot of emotional energy and hope into this approach to the gallery, and then the gallery comes back to me and says, thanks for the submission, but no, thank you. It can almost become a crushing experience. Boy, they must not like my work. I must not be any good. And you start to go down that path. And I find this to be a kind of recipe for disaster when it comes to approaching galleries. My suggestion is that we want to really play the numbers the other way around, where we want to say there's a fairly small likelihood of any individual gallery taking my work, but let's say it is a 5% chance, or maybe even a 2.5% chance. Well, if I turn that around and say, okay, well, if I approach 100 galleries, my hope would be that with those odds, I then have a likelihood of getting into 2 or 3 or 4 galleries. And if I think of it that way, it kind of changes my mindset about my approach to galleries. I don't have to take a rejection as an existential crisis. I just say, well, I expected that. I knew that my chances with this one individual gallery were pretty low, but now I'm moving on, and that puts me that much closer to a gallery that's going to be interested in my work. So I've got to keep pushing forward. And so with that in mind, with the idea that I want to approach a lot of galleries, I need to be thinking about how can I do this efficiently? And so when it comes to thinking about, back to Louise's question, well, when's an optimal time to approach galleries? My response is when you're ready right now. When you've got the submissions ready to go, you need to be doing it now, because if I'm going to approach a lot of galleries, I've got to be in a process of doing that. I've got to keep myself steady and getting sufficient number of emails out there. And so really year round can be ideal when it comes to that. Now, is there a time of year that's not recommended? I would just say that there are some very short windows right around the Christmas and New Year's holiday, a week or two there where people tend to be distracted. But otherwise, I wouldn't, again, put too much thought into that. You could start worrying about, well, is it their busy season? Is it better to approach them in their slow season? And that varies from market to market. And if you end up thinking about all of those kinds of potential reasons not to approach galleries, you can then find yourself in a position where you're all tied up and you are feeling like, I just can't do it. And we don't want to do that. We just want to get it out there, and we want to approach the galleries repeatedly. It's possible that you won't hear back from them. So you want to get a follow-up process going. And so with all that in mind, again, that's kind of what we're doing in the Art Business Academy, is giving you a framework to approach that process systematically. Gordon, I saw you had a comment or a question.
Can you hear me?
Yep, got you loud and clear.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment, because when I got out of art school, I went to New York and I curated for a season. And I just wanted to follow up on what you said, because we would get slides on a regular basis, and we would all get together and review the slides.
We had like days maybe of 35 millimeter slides.
Yes, exactly. That way back in those days. And we would look at just like 20 of them or something. And the first ones we get would be like, wow, that's I kind of like that guy's work. And then we go on and on and on. By the time you got to the 20th one, you'd almost forgotten the first one that you looked at. And so we would then kind of pick out of those ones we want to go visit. We would write letters, rejection letters to people, and we would never hear from most of them. And I know they get these letters and say, oh, gee, I guess I'm not that good or something.
Yeah.
And the smart ones would continuously send us their slides. And sometimes they would send the same slides, but change a couple of pieces. And if we got them frequently enough, then they would stand out in our mind, and we'd say, okay, maybe let's go do a studio visit for this guy. Okay. He was really persistent. That was one thing. And then the other thing I think that you said that really resonated with me was that it's important to find galleries that are showing the kind of work that you're doing. And it pays to kind of research that, because it may be that they don't fit in. And I remember a lot of times in New York, people would push people to other galleries. If you went to one, they would say, well, that's great, but you need to go down the street to that gallery. They're showing that type of work, and your better chances with them. So that's something to consider, is just, the type of work that they show. Anyway.
No. And let me just, that fits perfectly with kind of my philosophy and approach to this. And I would just echo what you're saying. If you kind of think again about the numbers involved, it can feel like, well, there are a limited number of galleries out there and a tremendous number of artists, and so the odds are stacked against me. And there is, obviously there's some reality to that, but that's true of anything you might approach. There are far more actors than there are movies being made, or TV shows, or local plays being produced. And yes, that's true, but we also kind of need to think about kind of some of the other side of it, and that is that if I'm one of many artists approaching galleries, there can be this tendency for a lot of artists to just kind of give up. And if I'm the persistent one, as Gordon was mentioning, that dramatically increases my odds. I do agree that it's a good idea to get an idea of what kind of art the gallery is showing. And certainly if I'm producing Western art, to name an example of art, a lot of art that's produced in the area that I'm in, it's probably not a great idea for me to approach a contemporary, modern, abstract gallery in New York City. I'm just not going to see any results there, right? And so anything that I can do to kind of do some research and get a little bit of a sense of how I'd fit in. Now, I would caution that you want to be a bit careful to not overdo that research. You don't want to disqualify yourself from every gallery except for the ones that have art exactly like mine. A lot of times galleries are kind of, they have a range of work and they might be interested in showing something that's maybe just a little bit outside of that range, or that's parallel but not perfectly fitting with what they currently have. And so again, if I'm thinking in terms of numbers, I want to send art out, I want to send my portfolio out to a wide range of galleries. And so I'm going to come up with a digital portfolio, and I'm going to come up with a system to approaching. My cost to approach those galleries is fairly low. I don't have to put a lot of time into it. With a digital portfolio, I'm not having to print anything or mail and all of that kind of stuff. And so I can maybe move a little bit more towards a broad approach to galleries, but I do want to do some research to make sure I'm not going totally far afield. And so again, I think that just kind of hits all of Louise's main questions. When it comes to crafting an individual cover letter, you're not going to want to do that. You just don't have the time to do it. You would want to come up with a template for the basic information and keep it fairly simple. As a gallery owner, I know what's coming in this email that says artist submission is the subject line, right? There's nothing that you're going to say in the email cover that's going to totally shock and startle and surprise me to find out that there's a portfolio attached. I know what to expect. So just keep it fairly simple and fairly short and get it out to as many galleries as you can. Okay, let's keep rolling. Again, we want to try and get to as many questions as we can. And this question comes from Melody in Canada. We've got a lot of friends from north of the border today. How does one get an art gallery to respond to inquiries of representation? Does one assume too busy to respond? So this fits very well with the last one. And that is the follow-up is going to be key. In fact, I don't even, with the conversation we just had, I don't need to spend much more time on this one. But just to say that it is likely, especially on a first round of submissions, let's say I'm sending out submissions to 20 galleries, you might not hear back from any one of those galleries the first time you email out to them. And it may be that they're busy, or an inbox was full and they're just not responding right now. And some galleries may even have a default of we didn't solicit these emails, we're just going to get rid of them. And a lot of times that's enough. If they do that, they'll never hear from the artist again. But if you follow up and send a second and even a third and fourth email, you overcome some of that, where a gallery owner like myself will say, oh, I've already seen Melody's email before. It's clear that just deleting it is not going to resolve the situation. Let's see what the portfolio looks like. And then I can respond. If it's a fit, we can have a further conversation. If it's not, I'll let you know. But that's what I would be going for. I would want to get some kind of response from the gallery. Obviously, ideally, I'd love to hear yes. But secondary to that, if I can't get a yes, I'd at least like to hear no, thank you. And so I'd be persistent until I get that kind of response. 4, 5, 6 emails over the course of again 6, 7, 8 weeks would certainly be appropriate. And you're gonna say, oh, but aren't I going to be annoying? And they're going to be irritated. And this is a case where you use the word annoying, I use the word persistent. And I think it's just critical, certainly with our customers, we work to be very persistent with them when they're interested in a piece of artwork. If you think about it, a gallery is your customer. You want to show that same level of persistence. Leslie, I happen to know I have you here. You mentioned that in your 25-year career, you've had opportunities to work with local galleries and art institutions. The question is, some of my concerns that without my active participation, namely promotion, creating rapport with collectors, that a gallery or an art institution not in my local area, how will they do what I've been doing? Could they be a good stand-in for me? Could they create appreciation for my artwork? I realize this sounds like a control issue, and it may be. Welcome a true partnership with a gallery if I could feel confident that they'd produce sales and shows for me with my precious inventory. Yeah, and it's a good question. And certainly an artist who has been focused on galleries that are, close and accessible. It can feel a little bit intimidating to think about working with a gallery in another area, both from the issues you mentioned, are they going to be good at showing my work, but even from a logistics standpoint, how do I get my artwork to them as it shows there? How do I rotate inventory and all those kind of things? Now, those can all be worked through, but that concern that you mentioned, are they going to do a good job, can feel even more intimidating. And I guess what I would say is that, yes, certainly it does sound like maybe there's a little bit of a control issue that, you like them to do it your way, or at least, be as active as you are. And what I would say is that there are many galleries out there, and all of them are going to have their own dynamic and personality. My gallery is going to be very different even from the gallery next door to me or across the street. And we're going to have a different approach to working with our clientele, and to cultivating relationships and generating sales. And that's okay. Everyone kind of finds, hopefully, especially as a gallery goes on, they tend to find what works for them. And, one gallery's approach may be very different than another's, but they may be just as effective. And so my tendency would be to say, to kind of think of this in terms of, well, is there an opportunity for me to expand my reach and reach a collector base that I just can't get to with my local galleries? And for most of us, the answer is going to be an emphatic yes. There are definitely opportunities out there. And then once I've decided that, I also need to decide, okay, do I have the inventory to do it? If I am generating so many sales locally at price points that I'm happy with, then the argument becomes a little harder. And you say, well, why would I even bother with reaching outside my local area if I'm generating the sales that I want to here? For most of us, that's not going to be the case. Most of us are going to say, okay, I've got my local galleries and venues, and they are generating some sales for me, but my production, the inventory that I'm producing, continues to grow, and it's clear that I have excess inventory. I need to get out into additional venues in order to, again, optimize my production against my sales. And so that being the case, I'm going to have to trust a little bit that as I do some outreach to galleries, they may do things differently, but I'm going to give it a try. I'm going to experiment. I'm going to see how well these galleries do for me. And who knows, maybe I'll learn something from their approach and the way that they do things that I can then bring back to my local venues and it will help me here. I work with many artists who are not in our local area. And in fact, about last check, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the artists that I work with are in the state of Arizona. And the rest are from all over the place. I have artists from Canada, and I've shown artists from Europe, and certainly the East Coast, and all over the United States. And ultimately, the hope is that it's an opportunity for those artists to get artwork here to Scottsdale, to a well-developed art market, and to reach collectors that they would not have otherwise had an opportunity to reach. And I may not do things the way that you would do them, but over the years, we figured out and are continuing to develop the pathways that lead to sales for our gallery. And so I would encourage you to give it a shot. I know it can be concerning, and I would suggest that there are some things you can do to get a sense of how the gallery works. It's a good idea as you're considering working with a gallery out of state or in another market to have a conversation with some of the other artists who are showing in that venue. Ask them, I see that you're showing with Gallery XYZ. I'm considering showing there. What's your experience been? Are they good to work with? And what you'll find is that, the art community is very willing to share that kind of information. And they'll be willing to give you feedback, and one way or the other. And that can be incredibly valuable for you. We've done it. We've run ourselves right out of time. Some great questions and kind of some focused pricing and venues. I did not get, I think I got to about half the questions that were submitted. Appreciate your questions. We will have another one of these sessions in March, third week of March. So if I didn't get to your question, please submit it again. And we'll look forward to getting to all of those questions as we get the chance. We will be back here next Wednesday with another an artist's review. And so look forward to having you join us then. And in the meantime, keep following us on red.blog. I try to post articles, and a lot of them are inspired by the questions that you're asking here. And then we'll have other opportunities for these conversations. Thank you so much for joining us.